Gavel. I'd like to call the meeting to order, please. We do have quorum. I'd like to call the meeting of the Budget Subcommittee for City Hall and Etobicoke Civic Center consultations to order. Can I have everybody at the back of the room please sit down? Thank you. This meeting is one of a series of meetings that are happening all across the city to hear public deputations on the 2020 capital and operating budgets, and I want to welcome and thank everybody for coming tonight. I'll also like to welcome the Budget Committee members and any other councillors who may be joining us. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. You can, of course, follow us on your computer, tablet, or smartphone at www.toronto.ca/council. Are there any declarations of interest under Municipal Interest Act? Seeing none, I just wanted to let everybody know we do have a large group of people here deputing tonight. At this point, about 50 people. I'm going to be moving a motion that will limit anybody till after. If you come after 6:30, you will not be able to speak. So hopefully, if you haven't registered, please get to the clerk. The motion will be that speakers who have not pre-registered for the 6 p.m. sessions of City Hall consultations be allowed to register to speak until 6:30 p.m. January 20th, 2020, after which no further registration is allowed and speakers list will be closed. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. And again, if you'd like to register for the session tonight, please see the clerk's staff. I do want to, as I'm looking on the list, I want to make sure that we're trying to be as fair as possible to everybody to have an opportunity to speak. That's the number one priority we have. I'm also noticing there are a lot of organizations or groups that are on here. If at all possible, we would request that you try to combine some of your presentations instead of doing the same deputation over and over again. It would make much more sense if you can combine, but I'll leave that up to you. And again, that's for the purpose of ensuring, number one, that we can get out at a reasonable time and that everybody has an opportunity to be able to compete before us. So any questions from the committee members on the process? Great. Let's start the first deputation. I will move down the list, name the first 3 or 4. First is Barbara Falby. Second is Reverend Maggie Helwig. Third will be Joel Sterling. So I'll begin with Barbara Falby. Again, just to let everybody know, you will have 5 minutes to speak. Because of the number of people, I will give a bit of a nudge about 15 seconds prior to the 5 minutes, but I'll be very firm on trying to close off at 5 minutes. So I just want to make sure everybody's aware of that. Thank you. Go ahead, Barbara. Is a little button on? Just press the button. There we go.
My name is Barbara Falby, and I'm representing For Our Grandchildren, a climate action group which began in 2007. We have been advocating for awareness and action on the climate through public forums and recently at our website for the last 13 years. I'm wondering if any of the committee members know the current carbon count.
We actually don't ask questions.
We're not supposed to. Okay.
No, you just speak to us.
Okay. Okay. It's just rhetorical then. Is that okay? Yeah. I'm wondering about the knowledge about the CO2 count, which is supposed to be the baseline. And January 17th last year, the count was 409.9. And this year, January 17th, the date registered a count of 412.92, an increase of 3 points. These increased numbers indicate that global and hence Toronto's state of emergency declaration is most appropriate for describing the runaway climate change we are experiencing. With apocalyptic wildfires in Australia, California, and Alberta, epic flooding in Alberta and Toronto, and recent blizzards in the Maritimes and Vancouver. These scenarios demonstrate why it's essential to build awareness and training strategies to make people think of climate strategies that work. Mayors of New York City and London found that reducing fossil fuel dependence, beginning with their investments, has resulted in positive returns to their balance sheets. Our provincial government has seen a health cost benefit from banning coal, with a reduction of asthma cases. Many results of climate change are spin-off effects like unwanted noise, heat island effects, etc. Many governments ignore these spin-offs because their silo effect operations do not reveal the many savings from eliminating fossil fuels in reduced mining effluents, quieter transportation, lower air pollution, and a safer, quieter, healthier world. To appreciate the many harmful effects of unbridled fossil fuels, it is best to be able to see the current emergency of high CO2 GHG numbers echoing and re-echoing, creating many harmful effects in many different situations. To avoid the silo effect, I have included strategic actions to address the climate emergency that are outside the jurisdiction of the city, for the reason that greenhouse gas emissions do not respect those jurisdictions, so why should we? And I made up a table of 3 columns. The first one, budgetary cost. The second one, a description of the action. And the third one, carbon audits. So there should be carbon audit, plus and minus, for every strategic action. The airport, for example, if it were shut at night, could see a reduction of a third in the greenhouse gas emissions, because those emissions are worse at night. The tables also give room for quantifying and qualifying information like that. The lack of awareness is problematic, and I'm wondering if it might be an idea for the former environmental commissioners of Ontario to provide some input into climate strategies, because they've studied the problem. And I'm wondering if they've been approached at all for that kind of, and perhaps their costs could be embedded in the budgetary process. And that's, the WMIS program is already in place, and that could be used to spread information about climate change as well. So that's mine.
Thank you. Councillor Layton.
Just very quickly, I've actually been in touch with the most recent Commissioner of the Environment to help inform Council's response to the city, city staff's Vision Zero 2.0. So I'm hopeful that caller's a little messed up. I'm hopeful that she'll be able to put us together a little bit of a team. It's putting a lot on her shoulders, and we aren't setting aside money within the budget for it, but it certainly got a positive response, and so that idea is, I think, actually going to happen, which is pretty exciting.
Great, okay.
Thank you, and thank you very much for coming. Next is Reverend Maggie Helwig. Is the Reverend here? I haven't seen her. No? Okay, next is Joel Sterling.
Good evening. The city does have a lot of roads and sidewalks which are not maintained properly in wintertime. The money that is budgeted every year needs to be set aside so some of it, so the roads and sidewalks can be maintained properly. And it doesn't matter where you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next will be Martha Halima Butahar. I pronounced that correctly, I'm hoping?
Almost. Close enough.
Welcome, you'll have 5 minutes.
Hi, so my name is Marwa Budahar, and I am part of the Toronto Youth City Council. So as a youth, I would like to thank you guys for the opportunity to provide some of my comments about the city's proposed budget. So city services impact us more than we know. They cover things from library books to garbage to recycling and the TTC rides. Now, all of these things are individually important, but obviously when we put them all together, they make the building blocks for a strong and successful city. So that being said, there are a couple of areas that I believe that can be improved upon that I'm particularly passionate about, one of which that I'll be talking today about, which is the youth violence that's in the city. So when we look more closely at the budget, there are very few programs and initiatives that are set up to receive funding. These programs can include targeted youth programs and prevention measures that deal with the root causes of youth violence that is rising in the city. So experts are saying that these kinds of programs are essential to any kind of youth active communities, and especially when Toronto shootings and acts of violence have really been becoming very bad over the past couple of years. So the anti-gun violence plan that was developed in July 2018 still remains very underfunded, which causes young people to be killed as a result of many shootings. Now, this shows us firsthand that the importance of finding and solving the root problems that are developing into the rise of not only gun violence, but also youth gun violence in our city. The program should be in place and should be well funded to protect the youth and the future of our city. Now, to quote Mayor John Tory, when he said, while the budget invests an additional $18.6 million in poverty reduction and addressing the roots of violence, I firmly believe we must go further in investing in kids and families, especially as it relates to the threat posed by escalating gun violence. Now, I agree with him. We do need to find ways to make more investments in kids, as well as addressing the root problems related to gun violence and the root problems as to why they are rising over the years. The $18.6 million is a large amount of money, but it is also simply a small fraction of the city's $13.53 billion operating budget, which also includes a $12.1 million in new police spendings, which is a part of the Toronto Police Service's proposed budget for 2020, which is already over $1 billion, which is obviously one of the city's single biggest line items. Now, of course, we appreciate the kind words of our mayor, but having a budget that reflects those words would also be very helpful in achieving our goals into reducing youth violence. Now, just one of the examples of how dismissive the budget has kind of been to these root issues and addressing them is when the TO Ward's piece requested funding, and however, their request was later pushed to another date. All the while, at the very same time, the Toronto Police asked for $1.5 million to fund a 15-week anti-gang initiative called Project Community Space. Now, the way these two proposals are juxtaposed is quite interesting, as one of them is aiming to deal with the root causes of guns and gang violence, which in turn will reduce those violences in the future, and the other is dealing with the aftermath of those kids who never actually received the opportunity to get that intervention when they were younger and are now grown up and are still active in gun and gang violence. So as a youth, I concur with Councillor Mike Layton, and I too ask for the staff to look at funding for programs that address violence and poverty reduction under a closer lens and at double the rate of the increase as Toronto Police. So this issue is really becoming very, very prominent issue in Toronto, and if we don't find a way to address the rising root problems, and we never kind of address them until they become a problem and we see rising gang rates and rising gun use rates, then it'll kind of just be like a never-ending circle. So that's something that I'm very passionate about, and I think the budget could maybe also reflect how we can get closer to our goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mara. Next is Olivia Day. Olivia Day. Okay, next will be Dal Vasquez. Dal Vasquez. Oh, there you go. Thank you. Welcome. You'll have 5 minutes.
Hello. Thank you. Good evening. I would like to begin by thanking the Budget Committee for allowing me to speak at this consultation. I would also like to thank the CYC for helping establish this relationship between young people and the city so that youth can contribute actively in the democratic process. Members present, tonight we discuss the importance of money and the manner in which it is allocated. Far be it from a well-dressed man in a suit to tell public officials how to manage public funds. This irony is not lost on me. However, the conventions which require me to present myself so formally obfuscate the need to reconsider how the city collects its revenue. As I awaken each morning to a dim sun, I grip my wallet tightly, shivering in the freezing cold of our Toronto winter mornings. Each tap of my Presto card, a chilling reminder of how the money I saved up for school must first be divided to getting me there. Like many students, I don't earn a lot. I devote my time to reading and learning, contributing actively in my academic community, and nurturing my passion by serving youth. When I left my home in Ecuador, I made my family a promise. Nothing would impede my education. So in the summer, when my scholarly duties have been fulfilled, I work all season long to compensate for the debt I've incurred while at school. With cuts to public education, what little I make in these desiccant months is quickly cleaved at by student fees, making transportation costs weigh all the more heavily on my shoulders. Upon looking at this year's operating budget presentation, page 20 caught my eye. 3 rows down, I saw a figure which caused my heart to sink. $1.3 billion are to be collected from TTC fares alone. A sum of this magnitude is not easily dismissed, and I would be naive to think that denying the city $1.3 billion in funding would be accepted without opposition. Yet in urban centers around the world, municipalities have committed themselves to providing their residents with free public transportation. Here in Canada, we can turn our gaze towards Winnipeg and Calgary. These cities provide free transportation services across the city and between areas of the downtown core, respectively. Despite not offering extensive coverage, we can at least see that this model is in fact achievable. In 2017, a case study published in the Journal of the World Conference and Transport Research Society reveals that beyond our borders, fare-free public transit systems led to an increased ridership between the year they were launched and the year the study was published. In obeying France, ridership increased by a factor of 2. China's public transport system in Chongqing experienced a 550% ridership increase. And in Templin, Germany, ridership increased 13 times. Furthermore, reducing the economic barriers to access public transportation provide tangible benefits to all sectors of society. In the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, researchers Lauren Gase, Tony Kuo, Stephen Touch, and Jonathan Fieldings published their findings on the impact free public transit passes could have on students. However, given that their research took into consideration the welfare of students from kindergarten to college, their data is of benefit to youth at large. If transit passes were made free to youth, we could potentially see, as the researchers described, increased school attendance, increased school funding, fewer instances of juvenile delinquency, and healthier families and communities. Additionally, these researchers reasoned that free transit passes could decrease substance abuse, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and improve neighborhood conditions, all consequences which stand to benefit broader demographic sectors. After hearing this, we cannot ignore the fact that public transportation is not simply a financial perk for riders, free public transportation that is, but largely a public good. Thus, with the literature indicating that this model contributes favorably to both the transit system, with increased ridership, and the public, for the reasons just mentioned, I must inquire if our funding model needs to change. At my university, our motto is Tentata Vida. The way must be tried. So now I ask you, and of course rhetorically, why hasn't it here? Thank you.
Thank you. Next, thank you very much. Next is India Das Brown. India Das Brown. Alara Karahan. Alara Karahan. Maya Fahili. Maya Fahili. Kamitha Satanyaranjan. welcome Kamitha.
Hi.
You will have 5 minutes.
So, my name is Kamitha Sakunarajan. I am the youth counselor for Ward 20, the Scarborough Southwest, and a youth representative on the West Scarborough Neighborhood Community Center Board of Directors. In 2019, according to data released by the city, Employment and Social Services received $62.19 per year based off of a $30,020 property tax at a home value of approximately $665,600. Data shows that 31,900 OW clients found employment, and for the 2020 year, the city has proposed to serve 83,000 monthly OW cases, $865 million for paid benefits, and a 45% reduction on caseload on assistance. I come to you today to consider investing more specifically into programs to aid youth, vulnerable youth of color, and new immigrants to the country. In Toronto, unemployed youth have higher rates of psychological distress, lowering physical health, reduced quality of life, and limited career trajectories, etc. Many that search lack trained skills, knowledge, and connections. This is particularly prominent among Indigenous, newcomer, and minority youth. I believe that a stronger focus on improving the city's employment services would economically benefit Toronto and its rising generation. We would like to see more done to close the gap between youth and the support that is in place, and more development towards building those networks and programs, particularly programs that are focused on skills development to match the demand of the current marketplace. These programs are vital to educating young people about what will be expected of them as they grow to become young adults, and should be better able to adapt to a rapidly changing economy. The funding will allow these programs across Toronto to better help youth to build those skills and those connections, and open the door to greater career opportunities and an improved quality of life. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Next is Camera A. Miranda Radbourd. Welcome, Cameron.
Hi,
You'll have 5 minutes.
thank you so much. And thank you all so much for doing this. My name is Cam. I'm the chair of the City Youth Council of Toronto. And it's really a privilege to be able to speak to you. I'm here today to recommend, like my colleague Dale, that transit be made available for free in Toronto and that property tax be raised to make up the difference. Now, he's given you some very good arguments on the logistics of doing that, so I just want to share a memory of mine that sort of started my lifelong love for public transit, and which in turn started my belief that it should be made accessible and available for everybody. So when I was 5, there was a hand, foot, and mouth disease outbreak at my school. That's not the good part of the memory. But as a result of the outbreak, my school closed for a couple of days, and so my mom and I decided that we would visit every subway stop in the city. And we spent a couple of hours planning with my Toronto Rocket placemat, which I got when I was 2 and which was my favorite gift. And then we bought a bunch of tokens and child tickets, and we set off. I vividly remember most of that day. I remember looking out over the Bloor Viaduct between Broadview and Castle Frank as we sped past the traffic stalled below us. I remember being terrified for my young life when the Scarborough RT rumbled and shook as it left the station. I remember that comforting, sweet smell of Cinnabon when we arrived back home at Eglinton Station in the riding of Toronto-St. Paul's, which is where I'm from. Now, it was as much a culinary tour as it was a transit one. And by the end, I feel like I had traveled the world. In my eyes, the TTC was beautiful in a way that even now I can't fully express, and certainly not in a short deputation. And I'm telling you this because I believe that beauty should be accessible to everybody. Now, I don't think it's outrageous to say that if you ask the average person on their commute, that they would not share my thoughts on the TTC being beautiful. But the fact is, the fares that people are paying now are hurting them. Right now, for an adult, it costs a full meal to get to and from work every day. And that's essentially being charged as a flat tax. Not just a flat tax on everybody, but a flat tax on the people who can afford to pay it the least. Now, I don't understand why the property tax can't be raised to make up that difference instead of people all paying the same. It seems to me that as opposed to paying for the TTC with the fare box, it seems that they should be paying through the money that they pay to the government already, such that it can be scaled progressively. Now, I was a little late today, and the reason for that was that my streetcar got a little stalled. And so, you know, I didn't have the opportunity, as much as Dale did, to give you a really thorough breakdown of how I think this ought to be done. But my fondest memories, my first kiss, when I met my boyfriend, were all on the TTC. And it seems to me that those memories ought to be available to everybody else too. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Layton.
So it might not be a surprise to you that this is the second year in a row that we'll see a increase in TTC fare, and that over the course of the last decade and a half, transit fares have raised at over twice the rate of inflation, whereas property taxes are hovering at about the rate of inflation. Does that surprise you at all?
I mean, not really. I think that public transit isn't really being seen as a public service anymore. I think that public transit is sort of seen as an unfortunate necessity. I think that public transit can be really great. I'd rather be sitting in a subway that's going super fast under the ground than being driving a car. And so I think that really, I know you've been doing some really great work on transit, but I think that some of your colleagues should look into the fact that it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be an expense. It can be something that we can invest in that can save us money, and something that Toronto can be proud of.
So our user fee policy is a spectrum, and it starts with the city pays 100% of things that are public service, that benefit everyone. And then at the other side is individuals pay 100% through a user fee of stuff that benefits only them. So think about that, 0 to 100. 0 paid by the city, us collectively, or 100%. So things like roads are paid for 100% by the City of Toronto. Public transit is paid 75% by the user. Do you think we got our priorities right in that, given that technically speaking, a ticket to the zoo is deemed as much a public benefit as public transit right now in the City of Toronto, if you look at our user fee policy?
No, I don't.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next is we have Anne Rundle, Harim Saeed, and Leslie Keston.
Good evening. My name is Anne Rundle. I am connected with Green 11, but I'm not speaking on their behalf today. I'm speaking for myself as a citizen. And I'd like to thank you, councillors, for your work in making our city livable and beautiful. And I'd especially like to thank you for the climate emergency declaration and the implementation initiatives, which I think of as our New Year's resolutions. But I have to say, councillors, this budget feels like one of those New Year's when you wake up knowing it's time to start on the resolutions, but a little too fuzzy to take proper action. Yes, I am talking about the low level of funding addressed to carbon emissions in this budget, and most particularly about the allocation of about 44% of Toronto's capital budget to repairing the Gardiner Expressway. One justification for this decision was the, to me, startling assertion that repairing the Gardiner would take cars away from Toronto. Now that has to be the champagne speaking. We all know the Gardiner only takes cars away from the city after it brings them here, usually for a day of work, and often to return the following day, day after day, emitting carbon all the way. Now, I should talk. I live near the Don Valley Parkway, but I work in Scarborough. So here I am, as fully guilty of carbon emissions as any coal rolling miner. My problem is, although my workplace is only 20 kilometers distant, on public transit, it can take 2 to 2.5 hours per day for me to travel both ways. But in my car, I can do it in about an hour. The fact is, I need you to put additional buses on Midland to Kennedy, cutting out about 20 minutes of wait time each way. But this budget isn't doing that. It's actually going to increase fares, creating a new barrier to public transit. Taking this back to the Gardiner, the thing that makes the Gardiner special is that people traveling from outside Toronto into the city have great transit options on the GO system, and there is an alternative roadway in the Lakeshore. Honestly, repairing the Gardiner looks like the type of New Year's Day where I decide to go on a major diet by buying a new set of cake pans. The day after New Year's Day, though, when our heads are clearer, we're going to have to ask ourselves, why is the City of Toronto spending about half its budget on people who live somewhere else and who could easily commute into the city on a bus or train? And maybe add another question, too. Why isn't the City of Toronto spending more money on reducing emissions? Maybe by extending public transit? After all, this is the greatest danger to our lives today. But wait, councillors, maybe when you decided to repair the Gardiner, you were thinking we could electrify transportation. Maybe you were looking forward to baking cakes, but using artificial sweetener in those desserts. Well, if EVs are what you're counting on to get our emissions down, sadly for all of us, the province is hostile. We will transition to EVs later than we should, much by far. So late, in fact, that the millions we spend on the Gardiner will actually facilitate and increase cars and carbon emissions in our city for years to come. I put it to you, councillors, we should not simply repair and replace what we already have because things are changing and they need to change. When you apply that climate lens to decision-making that you refer to in the Climate Emergency Declaration, you need to put front and center that your target is to reduce carbon emissions by 9 megatons a year. Your only target in this budget is 0.0006 megatons, and it's about buildings. You have to end the mid-century oil and gas solutions. Stop repairing the Gardiner. It's a decision made while we were still hungover from oil and gas and the glut of the past. Instead, applying that climate lens, make public transit more available. Help us Torontonians to get our EVs. Start us creating renewable energy for them and for all our infrastructure, and help us enhance resiliency for the coming challenges. Yes, you do have the money. Only you need to be thinking about a future very different from the present and immediate past. Councillors, put the money in a climate fund available for future city that we should start building now. You really could take the money from that pile intended for repair of the Gardiner, you know. If you don't want to do that, you could develop tax tools. Councillors, you should know that while I have written in a lighthearted manner, I'm really very sad about this. I think it is wrong to take our money and not spend it addressing the biggest threat of our time, climate change. And I think it is worse to spend it enabling the very emissions that are causing the problem.
Thank you. Councillor Layton has a question.
So I believe my vote to remove that section of the Gardiner will put me solidly on the right side of history.
In my good books.
And if I could find a way of opening it up again and a realistic way that council would support it, I would. I'll phrase this as a question, and I'm being overly generous to the other side here in stating this. The cost of lowering the Gardiner, which we would still have to do to remove it and properly do what was in the plan, put a nice, lovely boulevard and open up some lands for housing development, would cost perhaps it wouldn't cost as much, but the order of magnitude would be as great. So it wouldn't give us a $2 billion, because the difference between the two wasn't $2 billion. It was in the magnitude of hundreds of millions. Still a lot of money.
Yeah.
Still a lot of money, still worth looking at. I just want to caution that it wouldn't be, we wouldn't get the whole 2 point whatever billion. We would get a slight order of magnitude less than that. But again, I am firmly in support of the direction of
what
you're saying.
I'm not sure I heard a question in there, but
don't you think?
Okay, but I would say, you know, what you will achieve though is you will get those emissions down, and that is what we have to do. And that is the climate lens, and that should be, I'm saying to council now, I think that has to be front and center. And furthermore, you're going to reduce the climate emissions, the carbon emissions.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your attention.
Next is Harim Saeed. Number 13. Welcome. You'll have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to thank the council for giving me the opportunity to input my comments to the proposed budget for Toronto. My name is Harim. I'll be graduating high school in June 2020, and I will realistically not be able to go to university in Toronto. With how expensive housing is, it is impossible for me to move out of my parents' house and still go to university, even though Ryerson had been my dream for years. I will have to leave Toronto in pursuit of cheaper accommodations and abandon my ambitions of having a future in this wonderful city. The city needs to work on affordable housing for students and families alike, because me and hundreds of other students have to leave Toronto if we ever want to live by ourselves. It is too ridiculously expensive to live here, and it's near impossible to stay. I would also ask the council to put more money towards the Toronto Community Housing Corporation and affordable housing in Toronto. I've lived in community housing for nearly 18 years, and the service my family has received has been consistently inadequate. The superintendents take days, if not weeks, to respond to requests, and as a result, we've been left without heating, without a stove, without a fridge, and hot water, and more for days on end. If the Toronto Community Housing Corporation promises clean, safe, and secure homes, then why are they not given the resources to carry out their commitments? TCHC has 2,100 buildings and 110,000 people residing in their homes. According to the 2018 annual report, which is the most recent report according to the website, 45,800 homes will be in critical condition by 2023. That's 45,800 homes too many. 1 in 5 adults live under the poverty line, and those are the people that need community housing. However, the wait list to get into the program is 7 to 10 years long. That's hundreds and thousands of adults and families that need housing but are completely unable to receive the accommodations they need. There are not enough units in the system, and they are not given the money to acquire more. Our problems are not seen as priorities, and as a student and a participant of TCHC, I do not feel heard or seen by the City of Toronto. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions at all? Now, just one question. Are you aware that in this budget this year with the Toronto Community Housing, we're in fact doing the biggest investment we have ever done with, I believe, $140 million a year, along with a $1.4 billion investment to ensure that they meet all of the needs for state of good repair, but that's actually in this year's budget, and they're very happy for it.
Thank you.
Just want to make sure you're aware of that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next is Leslie Keston. Leslie? Leslie Keston. Michael Vickers. Welcome, Michael.
Hello. Oh no, my phone is frozen. Hello, I am Michael Vickers. I'm a local sculptor and painter and member of the Toronto Arts Council's Leaders Lab and the Arts Advocacy Network and the Toronto Art Foundation's Emerging Leaders Committee. I'm also co-director of the local arts organization Akin, which works to address Toronto's space crisis by providing roughly 400 artists with artist studio space through the use of vacant or underused space across the city, ranging from old butcher shops and storefronts to the new Mocha on Sterling Road, or soon vacant high-end retail space in the financial district. Roughly 40% of the artists that we support are at or below the poverty line. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and speak. I'll do my best to be short and sweet, and ultimately I commend the support that you and the Council have shown for the arts, including an increase in the Toronto Arts Council's funding and new support for the 2021 Year of Public Art. Thank you. The more foresight that we can have around the positive outcomes of having artists thrive and lead in our city, the better. The work that the Toronto Arts Council does through grants, space, and more helps thousands of us working as artists and working to support them to stay here. Last year, TAC invested over $2 million in programs outside the downtown core and awarded over $18 million in grants. I've received some of those grants, and they have helped me make ends meet. With Akin, we work on an extremely slim budget and just received funding for the first time from the City of Toronto. Many councillors remain unfamiliar with our work, but those that are helping support us are seeing the impact that we have on the city. The Toronto Arts Foundation's recent Art Stats report found that 89% of Torontonians believe the arts make our city a better place to live, yet 73%, nearly 3/4 of Toronto artists are considering leaving. I'm one of them. Perhaps Toronto isn't for me anymore, or the artists that I try to help. Supporting the arts and folks like the Toronto Arts Council makes good business sense. A dollar from the city towards arts organizations can leverage over $20 in additional revenues for the sector. Is there room in the budget to dream a bit bigger and better? Can we increase the per capita funding of $6.70 excuse me, per Torontonian to something a bit more ambitious? What would Toronto look like if that number was taken to 10? How great a difference that $3.30 could make. Where could that money come from? Taxing anyone holding any empty space, residential, commercial, or otherwise. In a city bursting at the seams, perhaps, in fact, the most valuable thing that could be redistributed are the vacant buildings that the city itself holds and leaves to sit unused. Beyond the arts, how many people will wish to live in a city void of community, culture, or of the organizations that make it happen? Akin is one creative solution to the space crisis, but the arts must be enabled to tackle the issue together from both the developer, public policy, and social enterprise sides of the table to help save our city from becoming one we no longer wish to call home. I love Toronto, and I'm hopeful that I don't have to leave. I remain optimistic and confident that city councillors and our mayor understand the unique impact that a properly supported arts ecosystem, guided by the Toronto Arts Council, has on the wellness of our city's artists and residents. I believe, though, that we must catch up to other cities with greater agility, urgency, and investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Sonia Yalda. Welcome, Sonia. You'll have maximum 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Sonia Yalda, and I am a member of the Toronto Youth Cabinet. I'm here to comment on the lack of sufficient funding the Toronto Transit Commission faces in light of the 2020 City Capital budget that was unveiled on January 10th. While the increased investment in public transit in the city budget is appreciated, it only covers about 44% of the TTC's $27 billion capital funding needs. The TTC identified these funding needs as necessary to keeping the service in a state of good repair, as well to meet requirements of functionality in response to increased ridership in the coming years. I'm here to ask the council members to consider advocating on behalf of the greatest asset a city in the 21st century can have, an intricate public transit system that citizens can rely on to get them from point A to B. Having settled in Toronto very recently, one of the aspects that excited me most about this great city is the presence of a subway and streetcar system that allowed me to move away from my dependence on motor vehicles. However, I realized very quickly that a system that constantly fails its users is one that instills resentment and a lack of trust. This is something I began to feel when I had to turn to ride-hailing applications like Uber to get me to my interviews and meetings because I no longer felt like I could rely on the TTC to get me to these important appointments on time. This attitude settled in after just 1 week of utilizing the public transit system. I felt anxiety at the prospect of having to use the subway to get to work, as I could not be sure I would get there on time, but could not keep using ride-hailing applications at the risk of putting myself in debt for the sole reason of trying to be punctual. If some of you are hesitant in showing your support because of a stringent budget, I have recommendations for funding said increases in investment. First, by introducing a progressive property tax, it would ensure that higher income households pay a greater share of taxes, as opposed to the current model of charging a flat rate to everyone. A second source of revenue that was pinpointed in a study conducted in 2016 by KPMG indicated that a motor vehicle registration tax could be implemented within 6 months and has the potential of bringing in an additional $18 to $94 million. As well, the study also identified that a parking levy of 50 cents to $1.50 per spot per day could raise up to $535 million, while only taking about 18 months to implement. Instead of turning to increasing public transit user costs again next year and punishing those who are already struggling, please consider utilizing revenue sources that create a more equitable city for people of all walks of life. My challenge to you before I go, try using public modes of transit for a week to get to work, home, or run errands, and see firsthand the challenges that transit users face on a daily basis. I am asking you to raise more revenue in order to freeze fares and ensure that TTC's capital funding needs are met. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Layton.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And just for the record, I've used the TTC 3 times today, and I'm going to have to use it a 4th time to get home. On the taxing, the revenue options, the VRT is always a hotly debated item here. Every year, it seems to come up again, and every year it gets voted down. The cost is, and it was when the VRT was removed, was about $50. $50 a year per driver, per vehicle. That's roughly the cost increase. Do you think it's fair that that's roughly the cost increase to TTC riders in this year alone, let alone in the last 10 years, when we've raised transit fares almost every single year to the tune of about the same amount? Do you think that's fair?
I don't think it's fair at all to give people who utilize our infrastructure a break when the people who live here are being penalized.
Were you aware that last week at Budget Committee, I requested a briefing note on how to implement a parking levy, and the Budget Committee voted against it?
I was not aware.
So we'll give it another try, but
Okay.
it's not looking good. But the more that the Youth Cabinet can advocate for this and talk to youth about how it isn't fair, that we just seem to be continuously taking money from transit riders, is very helpful.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have 4 people here: Jack McDonald, Tim Gilbert, Brian Pierre, Ellie Shermer from Transform Community Cafe, Inc. Will you be doing your deputations together, but it looks like
Yes.
you are? Okay.
Thanks very much. My name is Tim Gilbert. Some of the others couldn't be here today, but we've brought Pippa Lolia, and Jack, of course, is here. I'm one of the founders, co-founders.
Excuse me for being, so the other 2 people, are you registered?
Pippa is part of the group. She's replacing Ellie Shermer, if that's fine.
Okay, but otherwise, and who I just want to get.
Jack's registered.
I need the names here, so the first name? Jack. Oh, so you're Jack, okay. Yeah. And Tim?
Gilbert, yes.
And Ellie?
And
Well, you're replacing Ellie, okay. Great, and so Brian Pierre is not here?
he can't make it.
Okay, great.
Collapsing the list. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address this year's budget. We see an item that we hope is a sign of good news for community recreational facilities and people who provide programming, and that is the Community Recreation Growth Plan. Our understanding of this is that there will be funds available upon proper application for community programming and recreational facilities provided by not-for-profits like ours. We are a not-for-profit, started about 4 years ago. The concept actually came from a design exchange, charrette, what do you call them? A session which had key athletes who identify what was their start, how did they get started, and they started from community gyms and programming. And the problem that was identified by the design exchange was the lack of both facilities and opportunities, and even with the City of Toronto programming, which is very much in high demand, but over-registered, and all programming being expensive. So we started with using community gym at a church, provide programming to many, many families, and then led to start a cafe on Yonge Street. And our program director is Pippa Lolia, and she's here, who runs the programming. What do we do at that cafe? Pippa, can you address it?
So since we opened in June of last year, so many parents have come to me and expressed how their youth are on long waiting lists to receive mental health care. So through this social enterprise, we are seeking to fill in some of the gaps where youth are really needing support. Within our cafe, we offer high-quality food and drinks, where the proceeds flow directly into free creative classes offered in the basement of our space for youth 12 to 18. Some of these classes include music, creative writing, art, boxing, dance, and other forms of restorative exercise. So we've recognized that with technology at the forefront of our society, youth are looking everywhere outside of themselves to find love and validation. So we're presenting these classes as tools in building emotional resilience and drawing strength from within. One of our most popular programs is a youth barista program. So we invite youth to come and get real job skills and volunteer hours needed to graduate. And the impact has been major. One example of this is Tunisia. She's 17 years old and she comes from the Jane and Finch community. And she's been wanting to address the gun violence, and so this program has offered her a platform to develop a partnership with the Boys and Girls Club at Jane and Finch and transform. So starting this month, teen girls will be transported to our cafe, and they'll be exposed to yoga, breathwork exercises, and natural hair care workshops. And the idea is, regardless of what's going on in one's external environment, we always have the power to control and maintain our internal environment. We have so many ideas. Right now, our challenge is financial support. We strongly feel that in time we can be self-sustainable, but in the early phases, we could really use support, as we cannot solely rely on proceeds to cover our overhead costs and our rent. So we thank you so much for hearing us and considering us as beneficiaries. We really feel that the city paying attention to groups such as ourselves who care for the youth is the future.
Oh, okay, excellent. Questions, Councillor Layton?
Yes, have you gone through an application process at the city before for our community?
We've met with staff. We met with, first of all, Michael Thompson's team, and then we met with some staff there. And under the existing programming, everything seemed to have been committed to historics. And it's much like, you get the big majors and then the smaller ones, and you get fed into maybe $1,000 or $2,000 for odd programs, and it just didn't add up in terms of what we're delivering.
And the amount of work it takes to apply for
Yeah,
a couple thousand.
unbelievable. Yeah, and so there are programs out there. There are groups getting benefit. Certainly, it looked to us, and it was pretty much not going to happen.
And how much funding are you looking for?
Well, the way I actually described this to the mayor, who came to one of the events that we catered and helped sponsor in the neighborhood, and said that effectively we're in a high rent district. We're located at Yonge and Eglinton on Yonge Street. So if we can help with the rent, which actually just got increased from $8,000 to $9,000 a month, any help, that's the kind of thing that is the overhead that really is crippling. You say, well, why don't you go out to the suburbs? Well, that's the whole point. We're here where youth are. Over 50% of the people in our area are under 30 years old. And more towers are going up, more condos, higher prices, but there's no access.
It reminds me of some of the programming that Sketch does in the downtown core, around arts and youth and entrepreneurship, and it saved maybe the mindfulness side of it that they might be doing now. I don't know. And they managed to purchase space. But that was after decades of fundraising and building up their sort of roster of clients that then went on to do amazing, wonderful things in the world of the arts and make a lot of money and be able to start cutting checks for who helped get them there.
And I think those development opportunities are there with those. You get extra density as a condo owner. We're trying to talk to developers in the area to say, hey, is that a way we can do it? But that's a longer term possibility.
Well, and even in that case, you need to, the city owns the space in most of those Section 37 arrangements, and then we lease it out.
Right.
And you need to have some kind of relationship with the division at the city in order to qualify for a below market rent.
Right.
We have some space opening up at Yonge and Dundas, for instance, that this would seemingly be a good fit. It's not program space, it's offices, but whatever, you can do some fun stuff in lots of office space.
Sure.
But that would be a good fit. But
That's
it's
great.
figuring out how to get your foot in so that you qualify for a below-market rent if it comes
Okay,
up.
that's very helpful.
Okay. The number is also critical. How much is it that you need in
Yeah.
order to, from the city, that helps you leverage money from other sources? So demonstrating that through a business case, but finding the number. For instance, earlier today, like, we were approached by a group of individuals from Region that have a social development plan that's been on the books for 2 decades now, that's not currently included the budget, but they were very specific with the number. Then last year at the budget committee, there was a group of individuals that said, we've got this program that helps keep people housed by giving them a rent bank.
Yeah.
Here's a number that we could administer that would help us scale up the program. And there was a ton of interest amongst the budget committee, and in fact, I think it's increasing this year in the budget based on their deputations last year.
Right.
So
Well,
figure
right,
out
and
that number, and if you can start getting that in your communications to us, I think it would just be really helpful.
Well, our ask then is the rent, basically. That's what the ask is for, because everything else we think we can cover with donations and with sales, but that's the key component. You know, we have got a business plan, and we have provided that actually to Councillor Thompson's office. So we're in discussions with him, but we understand this program is still just a program. This is just the budget committee, which would then set up a program. We'd apply to that as opposed to direct approval here for anything. We're supporting the concept of a fund like this because, look, if the city runs the programming, it looks like we've heard estimates of $200,000 to $300,000 a year to cover the kind of programming that we deliver right now, a benefit to the community at no cost. I mean, you talk about offloading costs, the city doesn't pay for any of this.
What's your rent? What's your annual rent?
It's just went up to $9,000, including utilities.
Monthly.
Monthly, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next is Susanna Berkova. Oh, Zuzana, sorry. Welcome.
Hello. Hello, my name is Zuzana Bitkova. I work as a registered midwife, and I live and work in the Davenport ward. I have a lot to say, but I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to get to the point. I keep hearing how Toronto is a world-class city, that we should be really proud of the city, that it's a city that cares and welcomes all. Yet my lived experience and observations, especially in the past few years, are showing me otherwise. Every day I see more and more people living on the street. There's tents on the streets, on main streets, that were not there even 2-3 years ago. There's crumbling infrastructure, limited public services, smog, and a widening gap between the rich and the poor. On a daily basis, I walk past people sleeping on the street. Sometimes I feel like I'm stepping over bodies. I ask myself, am I living in a world-class city or am I living in a third world country? I am so overwhelmed, saddened, and embarrassed by the state of affairs in the city that I actually don't even want my friends from other countries to come and visit me here. That's the emotional side of my deputation. Now to the budget. Given the challenges that we face, I really believe we need a robust and ambitious budget to help us move forward on all these challenges that we are facing. And you've already heard some ideas today about how we could achieve that. So I have 2 major asks. The first one is that City Council declares homelessness an emergency, and that we mobilize funds in this budget to address that emergency. The second ask that I have is that given that we have declared climate change as an emergency, that we address this. And there's many ways to do this, of course, but given that transportation results in about 30% of our carbon emissions, I believe that one way we can do this is to invest more in the TTC. So I'm asking you to fund a bolder transit plan, increase the operational funding to the TTC, and begin the purchases of buses and streetcars now. We also need more rapid bus transit routes, not just planning. I don't want to hear any more about planning, thinking, observing, studying. I want them on the ground this year. This will make it easier for people to get to where they need to go until we can figure out something else. For me personally, public transit is a huge equity issue. I believe that investing in it will address, at least in part, some of our obligations in fighting climate change, and also relieve, hopefully, some of the pressure on housing in the downtown core, so people from the outskirts can get to their jobs and various things, social services, faster. Thank you for listening. I look forward to questions if there are any.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're good.
We're good?
Yeah, we're
okay.
great. Thank you. Next is Max Moore. Welcome, Max.
There we go. I congratulate you for trying to do a lot with a little, and I should begin by saying before moving to Toronto, I lived in Ottawa and worked for the Federal Public Service for 20 years. And as you may or may not know, but federal public servants sometimes don't have a lot of work to do. To fill my time, sometimes I would do research into, government financing. And this diagram is a summary of the things that I learned reading financial reports in Ottawa. And if I can explain the diagram, of course, the central pyramid is just an illustration of the 4 levels of government. International government at the top represents United Nations dues and World Health Organization and other international agencies. National government, provincial government, community government is the foundation of the government structure in Canada. Now, to the left of the pyramid, this is an estimate of the percentage of public services provided. And as you can see, it looks like municipal governments provide approximately 40% of our public services. It would take probably a Royal Commission kind of study to verify the exact numbers, but I believe that this is an accurate estimate of the amount of public services provided by each level of government. And now if we move to the right side of the pyramid and we see actual budgets, this is a percentage of total tax dollars in Canada and how they are distributed. And the community governments, which provide 40% of our public services, receive only 8% of the total tax revenues in Canada. I believe this is, the reason I wanted to make this presentation is to say that that's where the problem is. Toronto is trying to supply 40% of the public services which are provided for the people of Toronto, but you're only working with 8% of the tax dollars. So rather than trying to divide up small amounts of money, some effort, rather than just doing that, maybe some efforts should also be put into how can we increase the amount of tax revenues which are allocated to the city. Now, move up one level in the actual budgets. The provincial government number is 40% of total tax revenues go to the provincial government. This actually contains a little bit of money which is dedicated to municipalities. As far as I can estimate, 10% of that 40% should actually be allocated to community governments. I believe that the community governments are actually working with 18% of total tax revenues because some of the provincial money is dedicated to the city. But the city doesn't get it until it goes through provincial hands. So whether the city is getting 8% or 18%, it is still far less than it needs to do provide all the public services that it has to provide. So the right-hand column is, of course, a proposal. This is where we want to go. This is what we would like to see. And the question, therefore, is how do we get from here to there? And based on my research, I do have a couple of ideas, suggestions of how the amount of income for tax revenue income can be allocated to municipalities. One is a constitutional challenge that municipalities should have a share of income tax revenues. This is an idea that's kicked around a lot, but a lot of people give up on this idea because they think, oh, how we can never get a share of income tax revenues for municipalities. But think of it this way: in the 1930s, the provinces challenged in court the assumption that the federal government has a monopoly on income taxes, and the provinces won. Based on this legal precedent, I believe that if cities and towns banded together and sued the federal government with a constitutional challenge based on the provincial legal precedent in the 1930s, cities and towns have a good chance of getting a share of income tax revenues. The second idea I had is, and now this is a question.
You'll have to wrap up, actually.
I'll wrap up.
You got 5 minutes.
If I write a check to the city for half of my federal tax bill, this, in a month or two when I do my taxes, if I write a check to the city for half of my federal income tax, can the city give me a tax receipt that I can use as a tax receipt on my federal income tax?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Next is Maimuna Hassan. Maimuna Hassan. Stephen Donahue.
Good evening. My name is Steve Donahue. I live in Ward 4. I walk and ride the TTC to go anyplace. I want to address briefly the issue of the TTC fares, and of course I'm opposed to the increase. I seen recently Councillor Josh Matlow was here with Toronto students asking City Council not to increase the TTC student fare in 2020. Councillor Matlow said increased student fares are unfair to students who can least afford them. It puts the burden of funding transit on the backs of our kids. I agree with Mr. Matlow and would just broaden his words to say that the fare structure of the TTC places a blatantly unjust financial burden on poor and low-income public transit riders in this city. It's interesting to note that the program to help those on OW and ODSP and everything is called a fare. It's called the Fare Pass. Fare, F-A-I-R, pass. That indicates that the council knows, and the TTC knows, that there's something unfair about the present system. When I lived in the USA and we would be addressing state and local governments on issues of public funding for public transit, we would always point to the TTC in Ontario, Canada, as the first example of what to avoid. A system which back then relied on a fare box to fund around 60% of the day-to-day operations, and of course today is higher than that, it's over 70%. Toronto can't keep rubber stamping this dysfunction. It results in a financial fleecing of those least able to pay. And just a quick reminder, a fare is a fee for a public service, and thus a fare is a tax. So when I pay my fare, when I tap that Presto card, I'm paying a tax. It's a deeply regressive tax for a necessary city service. It's not based on ability to pay. It's disgusting. Last point. As this ever-increasing dependency on fares is not dealt with, the TTC will begin to experience a steady loss in operating revenue, as those who can will quit riding the TTC. What happens then, the revenue decreases, so fares go up, and or services also cut. Next thing you know, they're the TTC's telling us they're going to make drastic service cuts because they don't have the revenues. That cuts it back even more. We call that a death spiral. And I can tell you, when I lived in Allegheny County and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the transit system there was entering into a death spiral. And it took a lot of work to try to fix that. The fare box will not do it. Fares cannot run the TTC. Apart from fares, the TTC needs dedicated, reliable, predictable, and growing revenue streams for its operation. I recently seen where the TTC was starting this campaign to expose fare evasion. It's a big thing. You hear about fare evasion all the time. I want to start hearing more about the fare addiction problem, which the City of Toronto has. Otherwise, we're not going to go anywhere. I'm grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Zina Hassan. Zina Hassan. Beverly Daniels. Beverly Daniels. Oh, hi, Beverly. Come on up.
Good evening. I'm really pleased to have gotten the chance to talk to the committee, and I've been really heartened by all the ideas that I've heard flying around the room. In January of 2014, my grade 4 students returned to our Scarborough classroom full of news about their holidays in the dark. The ice storm had been fierce in Scarborough. They were buoyant and resilient, so they were happy telling me all about it. But I was chilled for them. My part of the city had not been nearly so hard hit. I wondered if the city could be made as resilient as they were, with storms getting more and more severe. And from storms to fires, how are Toronto bike lanes and bus routes connected to the Australian bushland? Well, through uncontrollable fire and what causes it. We're all so appalled by those fires, and although they're far away, we all want to help somehow, because what is far away can feel local. And with global warming, what is far away actually is local, and what is local is also far away. Gridlock in Toronto starts a fire in New South Wales. Carbon doesn't recognize borders. The idling car on the Don Valley Parkway emits carbon that goes into a global miasma. How do we unlock gridlock? We all know, by encouraging walking, cycling, and the use of public transit. Lots of good points have been made tonight about public transit. The TTC has a new 2-hour transfer, which is great, and free fare for kids. And their benefit, though, has been mitigated by the fact that, as someone else has said today, the TTC fares have been going up at twice the rate of inflation, and they're due to rise again. At the same time, the city shies away from using instruments like a vehicle registration tax, also mentioned, or water drainage fees, or this is one I love that I heard tonight, which was a tax on vacant buildings. I think that charges like a vehicle registration tax or water drainage fees for cars defray the costs of things like road maintenance. The carbon burden that driving puts on a city budget needs to be alleviated by fees that are connected to driving, not to taking the bus. If we don't charge those fees, people will continue to use their cars, and we need to move in that direction. The bike lane is better, the bike lane network is better than it used to be, but we're really still far away from truly safe streets for cyclists. Cars require 10 times more energy to run than bikes do and put a much greater burden on city infrastructure. Why spend 40% of the road's budget to give the gardener an overhaul? There's better value in bike lanes and transit. The expressway needs to be safe even if we are moving away from car dependence. Still, 40% of the road budget is a big slice. We've all been shocked by the rise in pedestrian deaths in the past few years. We need more crosswalks and traffic lights, especially in places like Scarborough and Etobicoke. And that takes money. We need to create a revenue stream through the fees and taxes that we've been mentioning. Let's think of cycling, walking, and taking the bus and the subway as real ways to get places where people need to be, instead of choices made by people with lots of time on their hands and nowhere important to go. It was great that City Council officially recognized the climate emergency, and Council was unanimous, and good for them. But we need to follow through on that declaration with money. We need to finance climate action. No need to start from square one. We have transformed TO, so add some money and jobs to that body. Let's take the big step of changing the city's investment policy, not put money, the city's money, into fossil fuels. And let's ensure that any new jobs that the city creates are tied to an overall climate-focused strategy. We know that cities, especially this one in this Ontario, have on-the-ground responsibilities at the higher levels of government, even if they may partially fund the fulfillment of these responsibilities, do not. When the TTC is letting people down, they turn their attention to City Hall, not to Queen's Park. City services are, if you'll forgive the pun, where the rubber hits the road. The ice storms and the floods are occurring much more frequently now than once in a century.
You'll have to wrap up, please. You're almost at 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm almost finished. It's City Hall that people look to when TTC lets them down. We need to look further down the road and prepare for the worst when it comes to climate.
Thank you.
That's good enough. I'm
Very much. Next is Inez Garcia.
Good evening. My name is Inez Garcia. I'm a resident of Regent Park. I sit in many committees, the Safety Committee and the TCAC Tenant Council, RPNA, and Mothers of Peace, and many more other committees. The reason I'm here to talk about is poverty and safety. That's a huge concern in our community, as you guys know, aware of the trauma and all the death that has been happening, the gun violence in Regent Park. We have to look for a solution of how to go about and helping our young youth. We have, through the revitalization, there's been a new community center and an aquatic pool. Our youth do not get access to this community center. There's always a barrier around it. It's great that it's there through this whole revitalization. There's many wonderful things in Regent Park, but there is a lot of barriers to our youth in our community, and for us as a parent to have grandkids or kids for the swimming pool, we always get the leftovers. I lived in Regent Park for many years. I love living in there. I get involved. I put my cents in. I try and do as much as I could for the safety of everyone. Like I said before, a lot of trauma. It's not just trauma for the victims that has passed away. There's trauma for us, the parents, and our youth that are going through a lot of the trauma. There is counseling only for a week, but what happens for the rest of the year, what we're going through. It's not just the victim, it's us too as a victim of going through all this and seeing this when we hear the gun shootings, when you're sitting in your own home, and you have to call your kids and your friends and saying, is everyone okay? That's a huge concern in Regent Park. The other one is suicide. There's been many suicide in Regent Park that is not talked, is kept top secret. we as a community member, we have to educate ourselves, and there's so much work to do about this suicide and gun violence. As you guys are all aware, it's a multicultural community. There's different ways of talking among each other and trying to help each other and supporting each other and through workshops that it's needed a lot. Lack of no jobs for our young youth. We understand a lot of our youth or some of our youth are being into the system, but there's not given a second opportunity, and this is why a lot of our youth too, I don't condone of the gun violence and stuff, but at the same time, we have to help them to find jobs and give them opportunities, because when we don't give them those opportunities, they're going back to where it's the wrong side of the road. The police, I'm glad the police is there, but at the same time, we don't need no more police in the communities. We have our community police officers. Having more police, I understand it's their duty or their job to do, but at the same time, it has to be taught of how to talk to our young kids, how to communicate, the language. It's not about just going, hey, you know what are you doing here, when they know who is who. All this stuff, it brings a lot of barriers. And we have to support each other as sitting in the safety committee of bringing a lot of mentorships, workshops to educate ourselves as a parent and to teach our kids, our younger ones, because this is their future. And this is my biggest concern. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions? Thank you. Next is Michelle Lee. Michelle Lee? Not here. Welcome.
Hello, councilors and city staff. Thank you for being here today. My name is Michelle Lee. I'm a proud resident of the City of Toronto, and I'm also a member of the Toronto Youth Cabinet. I'd like to take the time today to speak about the impact of the city budget on the climate crisis, with a focus on something that is a constant and an important part of the lives of everyone sitting here today, which is waste diversion. Previously, I had the opportunity to participate in a Transform TO public consultation. Something that stood out to me was the goal to achieve a 95% waste diversion rate from landfills by 2050. However, looking at recent statistics from 2018, Torontonians are achieving a mediocre 66% waste diversion rate for single-family homes and a disappointing 24% at multi-residential buildings. Looking at data from 2014 to 2018, there's also a notable lack of improvement in overall residential waste diversion rates, which stays at either 52 or 53% every year. There's a myriad of reasons why, despite efforts from concerned citizens, there has been no improvement. But today, I'd like to encourage the members of the Budget Committee to consider a selection of potential methods to improve waste diversion rates. Currently, a waste auditing system exists where consultants conduct auditing of residential waste bins. A potential method to improve waste diversion rates would be to expand this waste audit system to check for a greater number of residential homes. In the case of incorrect sorting, a refusal to collect the garbage and a warning can be provided, which is similar to a spot check system currently used by other Canadian cities such as Calgary. This could potentially be followed by a monetary penalty for repeated offenders, which would not only provide a deterrent for all residents, but can also be a potential way to fund such a program. I am also aware that the city is looking into ways to reduce single-use and takeaway items. Looking at Toronto's previous bag tax, a 53% reduction in plastic bag generation was noted between June 2010 and February 2011. I feel this is clear evidence towards the positive impact of waste diversion on waste diversion rates, which comes from imposing fees on single-use plastics. And finally, I would like to express my appreciation and encouragement of the current efforts to improve education on waste diversion. Community environment days, public advertising for waste diversion and transformed TO information, and particularly the TO Waste app, have made it a lot easier to understand the complex issue of waste diversion in our city. I hope that City Council continues to support and expand on these problems. Transform TO's goal of 95% waste diversion is ambitious, and as waste diversion gets more complex for city infrastructure and for residents, it is important that City Council supports a variety of measures to achieve this goal. Incorrectly sorted waste is also a resolvable but significant financial burden on the city. The unfortunate truth of climate change is that there will always be individuals who select not to be involved. However, by focusing on something as tangible as waste diversion, I hope the city is able to have residents make a positive impact on such an important issue.
Thank you. Deputation. Next is Gail Lynch.
Good afternoon. My name is Gail Lynch. I am one of the co-chairs for the Regent Park Social Development Plan. Specifically, our focus is employment and economic development. So that alone will tell you why I'm here. You know, when you talk about the issues in Regent Park, everyone would tell you those issues are systemic. And I just wanted to read a brief definition of systemic. A systemic failure may be defined as a failure due to flaws in a system. And we definitely have a flaw in that we are not getting the funding that we were expecting and that was promised to us. You know, I love where I live. I live in Regent Park, and I'm an immigrant to this country. I've lived in this country longer than I've lived in my country of birth, so I consider myself a Canadian, and more importantly, a Regent Parker, if that is such a term. I love where I live, but 50% of my salary goes to my rent, which is difficult. That maybe I need to come back and depute on that. The point here is, though, as someone who's working, if my rent is 50% of my salary, what about somebody who is not? And certainly, those are things to consider. You know, when I first went to Regent Park, I found, as I walked in the elevators, of course, it was the worst place in Canada to live, and there was feces in the elevators. And I thought, oh my gosh, what an awful place for anyone to live. And then it would so happen, or fate would have it, that I now live in Regent Park. I love it. So thank you to the City of Toronto. A fantastic job in terms of the buildings. They're beautiful. Everybody says, oh, I love where I live now. However, there's more to Regent Park than just the beautiful buildings. There is the social development. And we have those systemic issues in Regent Park: poverty, racism, classism, Islamophobia, homophobia, and the list goes on. Social development helps us to now look at our people so that 20 years down the road, we don't become the Regent Park of old with these awful buildings and all of these systemic issues still with us. And I want to talk to you about the project that I'm working on. My focus is specifically economic development and employment. And one of the first things that we are looking at is a strategy to understand what is the need for the 16,000 plus people that will be living in Regent Park. So the strategy starts like this. Let's understand our community. Let's understand how many youth do we have in the community, how many persons with disabilities, and if you're a youth, what area of business are you interested in? Do you want to be a plumber? Do you want to be a lawyer? Do you want to be a computer programmer or coder? When we understand that, then we can go ahead and put them into some very specific groups. So we're going to have job fairs, but job fairs that are not the job fairs that you expect to see where you walk in the room and there's just a room full of people. It's very targeted and specific. So if you're into the arts, this is the area you go to. You have a mentor there. You have people who are within that industry who can help you with career pathing. You may have some information in terms of education that you can do. Very targeted and very specific, so that we are not saying, let's just fill jobs just because to make a number, to make the city look good, but to say, let's fill a job that is socially responsible to the community. It's not just focused on having a job, but that there is a social responsibility component to that job. That I can look at that job and say, this is actually the career that I'd like to have. I thought I wanted to be a painter, but of houses, but I realized I actually want to be a painter of murals. So this is the type of work that we are doing. I also want to talk about the people in Regent Park and the work that they're doing around social development. And there are many people in this audience who will tell you that they're on 50 or 60 or 20 or 30 committees, 3, 4, 5 meetings in a day. So we, the residents of Regent Park, are committed to our social development, and we need the funds to do that, as you promised. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Councillor Layton?
You ended on just the point I was going to ask about. So I asked the question earlier today in the morning session after some deputants from some fantastic youth from Regent, how long this has been going on for. None of us really know because it predated all of us. Some of these kids would have been like in diapers when this originally happened, but someone in the crowd wasn't and was around since the beginning. Sent me a document from 2007. How long have you been involved with this, or do you know when the city made the commitment to the people of Regent Park when they said, look, it's going to get painful when we move you out, but you're going to come back, there's going to be great buildings, and hey, we're going to do something more for you. We're going to have this social development plan in place.
I can't tell you the date of that, but I can tell you that there's a document because I saw that document. So if you'd like to have a copy of that document, I am sure that that can absolutely happen.
I think that I'm looking at the document, which is the Regent Park Social Development Plan, and it's September 2007. We're talking like a long time ago, 15 years ago when this, or 13 years ago when that commitment was made to the people of Regent Park. And it's only now sort of starting to really ramp up. If I can say anything, Gail, it's keep up your efforts, because this is the type of thing that changes at the Budget Committee. This is, I think, an oversight on the part of staff to not fund it, and I really think that this has struck a chord with many people in the City of Toronto. We just need to hear more from you and from the people of Regent Park.
Yeah, agreed. And as far as the document is concerned, I'm going to go back and definitely take a look at that and get it to whoever it needs to. I don't think it was 2007, but I will definitely.
You know what would be helpful is if you sent it to the clerk, because then everyone gets a copy of it. It goes on the official record saying, here's where you made the promise. And it's going to be hard for us to look the other way.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Next is Susan Gapka. Welcome, Susan.
I go back even longer. Let's see if we can make this work. So I had a PowerPoint presentation and a computer, but I'm going to try this thing. If there's someone to make, oh, it's going to work. I don't know if that's big enough. So I'm going to try to do this. So anyways, so I went to the library, the Toronto Public Library downstairs, and made some copies of the PowerPoint, but the PowerPoint presentation I sent to the staff, and it should be distributed as just requested by Councillor Layton. Thank you for your time here today. I can't imagine sitting here and listening to 5-minute deputations all day long, and you do this a lot. So thank you for your service to the city and to the Budget Committee throughout this process. I came here and presented on the Toronto Trans Coalition, our needs assessment, a couple months ago at Executive for Poverty Reduction. I've been directed to this document, which I didn't find in the budget papers because there's a lot of them, creating a gender equity strategy and gender equity office. So I think my comments are around, as I'm going to take a few minutes to describe the hardship, the lack of services for trans and non-binary people in Toronto, and some of the data we've collected. But that office should be sustainable and well-funded. Can appreciate you have a lot of cuts from other levels of government, so I can appreciate your difficult task. So we did a needs assessment, and I just don't know how to do it like this. We did an online survey, 281 submissions, 236 from the GTA. We had 31 participants and 9 in-person focus groups. We had a very broad diversity of ages, identities, ethnicities. And the report is online, and it'll be in the document you get. What we found was a medium age of 25 to 34, and 37% of respondents were students, and 45% had a disability. Around employment and financial security, we found that the median income was below $30,000, and I would be one of those people in that. And even though I do okay, I'm moderately well adjusted. I'm still in the lower category. Less than 61%, less than $30,000 a year. 56% lived paycheck to paycheck, and 40% had multiple jobs to make ends meet. 62% of respondents experienced discrimination and harassment in the employment sector. And 19% said they believed they were discriminated in work because of their gender identity or expression. On education, we're a well-educated community, but we're underemployed. For example, 66% of respondents have completed some level of post-secondary. So the housing is, we had 23% unstable, unsafe 12%, and unhealthy at 13%. And you don't have to be a member of a disadvantaged community living in the city of Toronto to struggle around housing or employment. I think a lot of heads would nod on that one. And on health and well-being, 25% of respondents said their health care needs weren't being met. So I don't have enough time to go through everything, so I'm just going to skip to the 2 priorities. It is in the report that the PowerPoint that you can look at it in more detail. But we had some thoughts on employment and in housing, and this is where we see ourselves partnering with the City of Toronto and Toronto Community Housing around supportive housing, and why I'm bringing it to here and to the Gender Equity Office. We've got 2 committees formed, one for corporate employment. That's not what we're doing here, but trades, labor, and employment. So for all of that, I've got 10 seconds left. I just want to make the pitch around poverty reduction, strong public libraries, and trans and non-binary people creating a partnership with the City of Toronto so we can improve our everyday lives. I'll conclude there.
So you have provided that to us. Okay, great. So that'll get to us all then.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time today.
Aviva Gail Bunsell. Good evening and welcome.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to speak here. My name is Aviva. I'm 19 years old, a first-year university student, and I live in Ward 14, Toronto Danforth. I'm here today to urge you to prioritize climate action and social and environmental justice in the 2020 municipal budget. A year ago, Greta Thunberg said, "I want you to act as if you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if you would if the house is on fire," because it is. I'm encouraged and excited by Transform TO and Toronto's declaration of a climate emergency. I also know that this is just the beginning, and there is a lot of work to do. The UN Environment Program says that we need to reduce our global emissions by at least 8% a year to prevent catastrophic global heating. Right now in Toronto, we are reducing our emissions by about 3% a year. This is not enough and needs to change immediately. There are many ways in this budget that we can start to make this change. I know a lot of people, myself included, who would really like to bike more often. However, we do not because of the safety worries of biking in Toronto streets. Investing in bike lanes will increase road safety, encouraging more people to bike and reduce our carbon footprint. Continuing to invest in the accessibility and affordability of public transit will also make a positive difference for both social and environmental justice. This includes putting into practice the fair fare passes as soon as possible and ensuring all subway stations have elevators. We need to think about how climate change will affect those who are most vulnerable in Toronto, people living in poverty, people without homes, and people already facing forms of oppression. I ask you to approach everything you do with a lens of climate justice and social justice. Whether you're making decisions about how to spend our tax dollars this year or deciding about city programming, ask yourselves, how will this choice bring our city one step closer in the fight against climate change? How will this help our great-grandchildren and those most vulnerable have a livable future on this planet that we're leaving them? How will this put out the fire in our house? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Jade Armstrong. Welcome, Jade.
Hi. My name is Jade Armstrong, and I live and work in downtown Toronto. Thanks for giving me the time to speak here today. I was shocked to open the 2020 recommended budget and see police services at the top of the property tax investment. I cannot believe that the police get 3 times more from my money than Parks and Recreation, and an incredible 5.5 times more than my library. As crime rates rise in the city, I am disheartened to see that the money is so easily given to a violent, discriminatory service, while community projects are left underfunded. The Toronto Police Accountability Coalition has advised council ways in which the city can reduce the cost of the police force. For example, Toronto's current officer shift schedule is overstaffed. Having the same amount of officers working at 4 a.m. as at 7 p.m. is not an effective use of tax dollars, nor is having a 4-hour overlap between midnight and evening shifts. In addition to a waste of money, excessive numbers of officers on patrol at certain points of each day mean more opportunities for officers to direct harassment and aggression towards population segments viewed as distasteful and dispensable. The TPAC also advised council that the TPS can follow many other Canadian police forces and remove the rule that requires 2 police officers to be in a car after dark. This would lead to great budget savings that could be spent on actual crime-reducing initiatives, such as funding for youth hubs, recreation centers, social housing, and poverty-reducing services. These are more effective ways of crime prevention. However, council decided to ignore these recommendations and has raised the police budget by 3.9% to over $1 billion. Adding together uniform and civilian staff, the TPS has a grand total of 6,804 staff members in 2018. 2019 saw that number rise to 7,181, and 2020 will see that total rise to 7,450. That's almost a 10% increase in 3-year time period. No other city department comes close to that number, and I believe every other city department deserves that increase more than the police do. This fall, I attended a peaceful protest against the Toronto Public Library for allowing Megan Murphy to speak at one of their branches. The police presence at the event neither served nor protected Toronto's LGBTQ community. At one point, the police even allowed a car to drive right through the crowd. In addition to not reducing violence, the police do not prioritize road safety. More pedestrians and cyclists have been killed in 2019 than in the past 15 years. Collisions are at the highest they've been in the past 15 years. And yet, the Toronto Police Service report a 44% drop in careless driving charges and a 93% drop in unsafe left turn violations. In June 2009, 17,600 tickets were issued for speeding. In 2018, that number dropped to 3,300 tickets. As an avid cyclist in the city, I am constantly fearing for my life. The roads are dangerous. I swear I see a traffic violation by a car every time I'm on the street. In 1.5 years of cycling, only once have I actively seen a police car turn on its sirens and pull someone over for a traffic violation. And it was a cyclist running a red at Bloor Church. We need a serious discussion about what we want the police to be doing aside from spending $1 billion of our tax dollars every year. The City of Toronto needs to reassess just how much money is going to police services. Investments in social programs will do more for the city in reducing crime and saving lives than expanding the force. I urge Council to have the political will and practical courage to prioritize broad public interests over narrow police interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a quick question for you.
Yeah, since you're talking about policing, are you aware that the reason we're having more police officers is that we've had hundreds of retirees on the police services, so we're just hiring police officers to meet the complement that we should be at?
Yes, I'm aware.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Ismail Afra. Welcome.
Thank you, City Councilors at the Budget Committee. I think some of my community members have said it all. I remember going to the local champions. It's a city-run program, sort of to make sure that neighborhoods like Regent Park, which are neighborhood improvement areas, that there was a strategy in place to sort of, and I've said this in many committee levels and many conversations here, that they wanted to activate people. And in many ways, when I went to that local champions program, I learned about the community development approach, which is what's called an asset-based community development, where you rely on each person's asset instead of look at only needs, look at only weaknesses in a community, but look at where strengths lie. In Regent Park, there are lots of community members with a lot of strengths. And I think you've succeeded in creating social cohesion. You do need the old residents and the new residents intermingling. Today, you've heard both sides. You've heard people who've just moved into Regent Park and people who've always been in Regent Park. Social cohesion is being built at a neighborhood level, and that's a success story. You've talked about how all this began. It began with residents who are interested in changing their neighborhood. And I think when I looked at the City of Toronto, the first thing I did was I went to your search items and I put in there Regent Park, and I just did the timeline upside down, and I looked at the first time Regent Park appeared in your timeline. And one of the fourth lines is Regent Park Social Development Plan. It's right there. It was approved by the Executive Committee in 2007, October 1st. And it talked about the vision of why a new community needed to be rebuilt. It talked about that this new community would stand on two legs, the first of which is physical development, and about $1 billion went through that. And the third was social development, and that also needed investments, and that also needed resources. Sadly, that coordination of putting resources to the social development plan was left to on the sidelines until it required a whole new process of refreshing. And when we did our new Regent Park Social Development Plan, we wanted to make sure that the new social development plan had teeth to it, right? That that the promises of old was not only kept, that we created new structures for that. And the new structures said we needed this item to come back to City Council. It was on the outskirts, you could say, of Regent Park for a long time. And thankfully, through our councilors' efforts, we became engaged at the city process. We've seen one another at committees. And I remember much of your faces also at the last budget committee when we wanted to bring an item of importance to our neighborhood. Now we're back again. We're back again not to start something new, but to finish an old promise. And that promise requires resources. There's a lot of intricacies in City Council. One thing is we champion the cause day in and day out, and then we find out that the item is outside the budget processes. And we asked ourselves, what's outside the budget process? I didn't even know there were two categories, which was called enhanced and new inside and enhanced new outside. And when we asked why outside, was it a click of a button of a mouse, as Councillor Mike Layton had said? Who made that consideration? I'm not quite sure. But the item comes back to you, councillors, who have to sort of juggle the priorities and make decisions. The decisions are quite hard, and you've heard a lot of committees and community members who gave you advice. But the advice here is one of revitalization, and one of the first revitalizations among many revitalizations. And how do you want to approach that? I remember in university reading a book which was called, it was about space and geography. And it talked about using public funds for private ends. And what we said was that's not going to happen to Regent Park because this actually has two sides, physical development and social development, so that public funds could also be used for public ends.
You'll have to wrap up, please.
So in conclusion, we've done, there's a famous community development approach, which is areas of influence and areas of concern. I'm concerned about a lot of things, but I have influence on a few things. Today you have influence in changing Regent Park. I hope you exercise that rightfully. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Habiba Adan.
Good evening, committee members and members at large. My name is Habiba Adan. I am one of the board of directors of Positive Change Toronto Initiative. I'm also a mother who lost her child or son through gun violence. Positive Change Initiative advocates on behalf of the Black community in Toronto, particularly those of the Somali descent. Our eternal struggle is a fight for justice, dignity, and peace for our community. For the last 30 years, violence has impacted the fabric of the community I work for. It has inflicted severe trauma on my family and every other family, including children, fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, friends, and community. Much of that violence at its roots is due to the existence of systemic racism and structural disinvestment in our community. Incredibly, every summer when violence, especially gun-related homicide, reaches monthly on its peak, the city responds to invest in defunct policy measures. Those strategies include the allocation of funding to ineffective and harmful policy decisions, such as the installation of technology of surveillance, including cameras, shot spots, and IMSI catchers, also known as stingers. None of these measures assisted our community. In fact, more than half of all gun-related homicide inflicted on the Somali community is never solved. including my son. We need a very different and adequate resource approach to violence prevention. Don't take my word for it. Ask those who study the root cause of violence. In fact, I urge committee members to read the October 2019 report by Toronto Medical Officer of Health on Community Violence. I urge this committee to view violence as a public health issue and fund the tools of that domain to address it. I urge also the committee to increase funding to the Toronto World Peace Program, to Crisis Response Program, to Downtown East 5 Years Action Plan, and also action plan to confront anti-Black racism. You cannot play judicial justice with the federal and provincial government while our community continues to be ravaged by violence and its consequences. You have the policy leverage granted to you by the City of Toronto Act. I hope that you exercise political will to use them. You have the power to recommend the allocation of critical funding to community-based initiatives that enhance quality of life for Black community. Today, our community needs champions on this budget committee, champions who understand the necessity of holistic and evidence-based approach to community investment. There is an old Somali saying that roughly translated to, show me where society is spending its gold, and I will tell whether it cares about those most in need. Because the resources that the city puts in the gun violence area, especially police and cameras and all that, it didn't reduce gun violence. 2019, there was a 60 homicide and 492 shootings.
We'll have to wrap up, please. You're almost at your 5 minutes.
I'm over?
Just about, yes. You can
Yes.
wrap up very quickly.
Okay, and 771 victims just the last year. So thank you for listening to me tonight.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Next is Shraddha Pai.
Good evening. My name is Shraddha Pai. I would like to thank the Budget Committee for this chance to share my thoughts on the City of Toronto's 2020 budget. I live in Ward 19 and Beaches East York, and Brad Bradford is my councillor. I'm here today to request the Council to increase the budget for Transform TO, the city's climate action plan, to reflect the ongoing climate emergency. I'm a parent of 2 young children, a girl aged 11 and a boy aged 8. I worry about the world we leave behind for them because of the energy-rich lifestyle of our generation and generations past. We have all read about the devastation from the fires in Australia, but signs of climate change are evident even in our own city. We have recently experienced greater rainfall due to climate change, which is partly responsible for the increased levels of Lake Ontario and the flooding we have seen in Toronto. Our children's youth and old age will be marked by even more such severe weather conditions. As a society, we must also consider that vulnerable populations in our city will see increased insecurity due to the changing environment. My concern has spurred me to take civic action, something I have never done before. I attended the Transform TO meeting last October and support their plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 80% by 2030. I was also in City Hall last November when our council unanimously declared a climate emergency, which was fantastic. But as a previous speaker said, having the emergency status doesn't mean much if it isn't adequately funded to achieve this goal, which brings me here today. I believe the 2020 budget for Transform TO needs to more strongly penalize gas-burning vehicles and infrastructure, and to start dramatically building capacity for public transit and biking. According to Transform TO, vehicles contribute 38% of the city's emissions, so reducing vehicular use will get us substantially closer to our targets of cutting greenhouse gases. Improving public transit also builds equity by creating affordable means of transport. Let us balance the amount of money spent on repairing old highways, such as the $2 billion earmarked for the Gardner, with green programming like building a safe cycling network in the city. $61 million of the city bike plan is currently unfunded. Let us please fix that. Let us commit to finally building out the Bloor-Danforth bike lane. I have biked downtown from the beaches 8 years in the city, and I love it. It's a workout, and it's a commute in one. But every year, I get more nervous getting on my bike because it's unsafe. I have had friends who have stopped cycling because they've gotten into accidents. Let us earmark a fund for driver and cyclist education and make the streets safer so more people will leave their cars at home. It will reduce congestion on our streets and increase the health of our citizens. Imposing congestion charge and vehicle registration fees is also a good revenue stream for the Climate Action Program. More generally, Transform TO needs the ability to build a climate lens on municipal policies. Having such a lens will drive green innovation in this city. Now is a time to jumpstart a long-term transformation of Toronto, please, for the sake of our future generations. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Yousef Abdulamir. Welcome, Yousef.
First of all, I'd like to start by thanking the committee for this opportunity, thanking all the members. My name is Yousef. I'm a member of the Toronto Youth Cabinet, the official advisory board for the City of Toronto. I'm here today to advocate for those who can't right now because they're busy trying to stay alive. I'd like to start by sharing a story with you from this morning. I was on my way to work and I saw something that has unfortunately become commonplace in our city. I saw a young man come out of a tall corporate building somewhere near Yonge Street to check on a homeless man who had spent the previous night sleeping on top of the subway vents for warmth. I watched as that security guard tried to wake the man up to make sure that he was still alive. That should not be okay with any of us. Especially considering the recent cold weather warnings, none of us should accept that as a reality for any of the members of our communities. Toronto currently has the most expensive rents in the country. Over 100,000 people on the wait list for affordable housing, and nearly 10,000 people homeless every night. To put that into perspective, there were nearly 11,000 people homeless in New Orleans 2 years after Hurricane Katrina. Since then, that number has been reduced by 90% in New Orleans. Their strategy for that reduction was called Housing First. The premise being putting as much effort as possible into raising the funds to create the housing and accepting everyone as they were. Sober or not, healthy or not, the first priority was to find everyone a home. Afterwards, they were all provided the services that they needed to reach stability and live a higher quality of life. This is the same template that homeless advocates here in Toronto have been recommending for some time now. The Housing TO Action Plan, promising 40,000 new affordable housing options, and the change to the income-based definition of affordable housing rather than the market-based definition are commendable moves. But unfortunately, they don't do enough to address the immediate needs. It'll take a few years for that housing to become available, and as you all probably know, the number of homeless people who have died in Toronto has recently surpassed 1,000 people. This dreadful milestone is a tragic reminder that access to affordable housing is a life or death issue for so many members of our city. The budget fails to demonstrate a sense of urgency to the homeless crisis in our city. Shelter is not a luxury and should not be treated as such. Again, the addition of nearly 556 shelter beds through 2019 was commendable, but the target of only 143 new additions this year and pushing the overall target of 1,000 beds to 2022 is disappointing. Waiting until 2022 all but guarantees that more lives will be lost. That should not be okay with any of us. Council should reconsider the 143 bed target and the overall 2022 target. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Waleed Kogali. Welcome.
welcome. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Councillor Layton and Ziada and Crawford, for your attention today. I'm here to depute to the Budget Committee with regards to two things, specifically the process, but also the priorities that were identified by community members. So I'll start off with the process, and what I would like to point to is that at the TTC Commission, members of the public were actually not technically given the purview to register in advance, and the meeting actually was rushed, which was in violation of City Bylaw Section 7A that governs board meetings to depute because the report and budget was released Friday afternoon. A serious matter that I think speaks to the integrity of the process and something that I hope that members of council should reflect on. Although the process was not transparent and fair, disfranchising many marginalized voices, such as at the TTC Commission, racialized and poor members of our community were still able to try to communicate their priorities. And what I'd like to do is actually point to some of those reflections shared at the budget process. Specifically, there were two young voices from Regent Park, Salem Scott and 13-year-old Libby, that spoke earlier today, that spoke to the importance of not just fully funding the social development plan for Regent Park, which was approved by the executive committee in October of 2007, but they also spoke to the importance of supporting the community benefits agreement, which is an agreement that has been requested by community, specifically after going through a very thorough process of identifying what those priorities are. And we also heard from members of the community that spoke to the importance of funding transport TO, because the climate crisis is real, and we need that investment now, not tomorrow. We also heard about the importance of having green jobs, but also the importance of eliminating user fees for public services, specifically fares, which continue to criminalize many members of our community. And actually, I find it preposterous that when you're in the middle of downtown Toronto, in the most affluent neighborhoods, people will walk into the streetcar and not pay their fares, but in communities that are where poverty has become the norm, many of our community members are fined hundreds of dollars. So what I want to do is I want members of council to justify to both Salem and Libby why that policing receives over $1 billion a year, while Regent Park over the past over a decade has only received $1 billion, almost $1.1 billion. So a budget is a reflection of the political priorities of the city. How can we justify to Salem and Libby that our public libraries are staffless? How can we justify to them that our homeless and poor are not receiving the support that they desperately need from the municipal level government, the government that is supposed to respond to the needs of our community? My ask is a simple ask, and that is we should conduct our budget process with integrity, where the input of community is prioritized, which means that people are not shut out of the process from the beginning. And my ask is for you to listen to the voices, the few voices that came out through the budget process in comparison to previous years, but the most important voices that speak to the needs of the community, specifically in Regent Park, by not just funding the social development plan, but also the community benefits priorities through a community benefits agreement. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak. I hope that those points will be addressed in some way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next is Lynn Alexandrova. Lynn Alexandrova. Amina Attar, oh, sorry, is this Lynn?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. You have 5 minutes.
Dear members of the Budget Committee, my name is Lynn Alexandrova, and I'm a graduate student, St. George Campus, University of Toronto. I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to address the Budget Committee in person. My research focus is educational philosophy, and thus what makes good knowers for a society that is socially, economically, and bioecologically sustainable. The city has an important role to play in public education, accommodation, and incentivization. At one end, fines. At the other end, infrastructure for self-care and reciprocal care. Housing, transportation, nutrition, leisure/restorative activities. All those have environmental and keeping the environmental clean aspects that I draw your attention to. In a city that is as rich as Toronto, there are too many homeless people begging, sleeping on the streets. In a city that is as educationally equipped and educated as ours, there's too much littering in public spaces. Scaled up, littering transmogrifies into industrial pollution and a planetary hazard. During the strike back in 2003, I think, there was garbage falling out of garbage cans here on Yonge Street, and that should not be happening. So incentives are needed to stay clean on various scales within the purview of the city and its budget spending. I'd say leverage the knowledge-making and knowledge dissemination capacity of student and faculty of universities. Assign projects, advertise competitions, give part-time jobs if you can afford to pay, or at least volunteer positions to help upgrade citizens' awareness about staying clean and sustainable, from littering all the way up to clean energies. Thus, the city infrastructure is in a strategic position to help mitigate too much waste, where there is clearly a huge potential and a sizable investment for public good. Self-care and reciprocal care need and deserve to be upgraded at every single opportunity, at every single turn. The opportunities proliferate. Community building, events, and spaces are what can bring the much-needed eco-social change. Reiterating part of the list of items that I'd like to see given due priority in this year's city budget spending that I submitted in advance. The library system deserves special attention. Not only are our excellent branches resources for self-directed study, but they're increasingly becoming hubs for public education, offering events, programs, networking. I note that servicing the computer stations is key. Security is a problem if the libraries cannot afford sufficiently advanced protection against hackers. On 3 occasions at 2 different branches, I've seen files deleted from my USB practically in front of my eyes. Embarrassingly, theft does happen. I've had a pouch with a handful of USBs stolen and work over many years disappear. Number 2, as a student who travels to campus almost every day, I give high priority to affordable public transportation. TTC is well ahead of many countries around the world, but there is room for improvement. On 2nd, 3rd November, after working late on campus, I was rushing to catch the last subway train. I fell on the stairs, I sprained an ankle. I can tell you that I was not treated well by staff when they were closing the station I got off at, Dundas West Subway Station. I was shocked, but I'll stop here. I am also calling for strategic consideration of the highly controversial installation of 5G wireless infrastructure commitment to wisdom by the city. I'm looking far ahead. Whether you've discussed it at this point or not, prepare whoever will stay in politics. Well, we need to pay attention because I've seen controversial feedback on how dangerous and how safe it is.
You'll have to wrap up, please. It's at the 5 minutes.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'll just finish. So, a professor and head of health-related center at Berkeley asked the question whether we should be investing as much as needed. And he says, instead, we should support recommendations of the 250 scientists and medical doctors who signed the 5G appeal that calls for an immediate moratorium on the deployment of 5G and demand that our government fund the research needed, that's the US government, adopt biologically based exposure limits
thank you,
that
ma'am.
protect our health and safety.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Next is Amina Attar. Welcome.
Hello, my name is Amina Attar. I'm a student at the University of Toronto. I'm an organizer for Fridays for Future Toronto, and Mike Layden here is my counselor. I am thankful for the opportunity to speak on the budget. I would like to express my gratitude towards the activists for their work leading up to the declaration of the climate emergency last year, and the counselors for taking that initiative. And I am here today to ask for an increase in the budget to be spent towards the Transform TO Environmental Action Plan. About half an hour ago, I was attending a Sustainability Commission meeting at my university. One of the very first things that came up was eco-anxiety. What does eco-anxiety mean? It means that students don't feel like attending classes nor building their lives because of the environmental crisis. They are afraid for their future, they wonder about having children, they cherish the air they breathe, they're grasping on to every normal moment before things get worse. Meanwhile, I almost left university. This overwhelming anxiety comes not from the absence of solutions, but from the absence of action from our governments. This brings me to my first ask, for the City of Toronto to commit to an emissions reduction target for this year, 2020. You cannot say that you're committing to an emissions target of 9 megatons for 2030, 10 years away, whilst not committing now. The only mention into the 2020 budget of the target is with the implementation of the Toronto Green New Standard of 0.006 megatons for 2020. And that is good, but we need more, because frankly, that's not enough. Procrastination will not get us anywhere, and I know that as a student. It is absolutely essential that a commitment for this year is made, for which every reduction measure is matched. I'm also deeply concerned about the delay of affordable transit. I, along with other students, work in addition to our studies so that we can afford living and transit expenses in Toronto. Affordable transit is essential to our living and to the reduction of emissions. The FAIR, F-A-I-R-F-A-R-E, expansion of discounted transit pass has been delayed from March 2020 to March 2021 as transit fare prices continue to increase. Further, as people attempt to live more environmentally friendly lives, and as the number and intensity of environmental disasters increase in the future, which will play a substantial role in our city becoming more expensive, it is absolutely necessary that affordable transit is available. So I ask of the councillors, and I ask the policymakers, and I ask the people who ran with the intention of making our city better to expedite affordable transit. Lastly, much of my family resides in the country of Pakistan. Pakistan is amongst the 10 countries affected most by climate change, according to the 2018 Global Climate Risk Index. The GTHA emits 6.9 metric CO2 tons per capita, while Pakistan, according to 2014 figures, emits 0.9 metric tons of CO2 per capita. As you can see, there's a disparity, there's a difference. And Pakistan, as a nation, is already facing rising temperatures, flooding, storms, and droughts that are impacting the quality of life and people there. What we have to remember is that Toronto as a city has a role in this. We have the resources to dramatically decrease emissions, and we're not doing that. We have no established climate fund, and there's no mention of potential revenue sources in our budget, which was supported by Transform TO. We need to take the responsibility, and here you have the power to do so, and that is my final request. So I, as a student, a resident in Ward 11, sit here in front of you, commending the action that has been taken, but asking for more. For what has been set to be done is certainly not enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Ingrid Sheriff.
Hi, I'm Ingrid Sheriff. I'm a resident of Ward 19, Beaches East York. I was born and raised in Toronto and have lived in the Upper Beaches neighborhood for 36 years. I'm involved with Climate Fast, Toronto East End Climate Collective, and executive member for Beaches East York Green Party, federal and provincial riding associations. I want the Transform TO plan to be fully funded and a climate lens applied to all 2020 budget decisions. We have dealt with flooding due to climate change in the beaches area. The Toronto Islands have also experienced flooding. This impacts tourism, businesses, and residents. I never had a driver's license. My primary mode of transportation is public transit. I would like Toronto to increase funding for TTC. Public transit is essential in dealing with the climate crisis. Toronto is the largest city in Canada, one of the biggest in North America. What we do here has an impact on the world. Toronto needs to be a leader in the global climate crisis. Please fully fund the Transform TO plan and apply a climate lens to all 2020 budget decisions. It's Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I would like to end with a quote of his. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Next is Bexy Liu. Welcome.
Can I start? All right.
Whenever you're ready.
All right. Good evening, members of City Budget Committee. My name is Bexy Liu. I'm a resident of Toronto. Actually, I live in Riverdale. I've been in Toronto for over almost 20 years. So in all those years, except 1 year when I work in a place border to Mississauga, and every day I take a TTC to work, back home, and to visit friends, go shopping, buy grocery, and go to festival. Everything I use TTC. Today I really want to talk about the TTC, the fares and the services. Toronto is a great city. I really like it. In my opinion, the best part of this city is the public transit. However, over the last 20 years, while the population of the city growing fast, and this TTC is not keeping up with the needs of the population. For the people in Toronto and the people, the visitors come from outside of Toronto, and it's become more and more expensive. I feel like even I'm getting paid decent wage at work, but even for me, I feel, every month, $151 the Metro Pass cost is increasing, becoming a concern, and I sometimes can't help but thinking, about the low-wage workers, the precarious employed workers, and the low-income families, how they, deal with the TTC fares, and I'm just wondering, do they cut from their food, from their winter clothing for their kids or their families? yeah, I don't know how they deal with that. If the people cannot go from point A to point B, how can the people be productive members of the community in Toronto? Well, I'm not really expert. I'm just talking about how I feel. Yeah, I do know, affordable public transportation is good for everyone in the city, regardless if they, use it or not, right? And we all know, climate change is a big crisis today we face. And one of the best way to counter climate change, I think it's the strong, affordable, good public transportation. Actually, I went to Mexico City a few times. Actually, to my surprise, Mexico City has a great public transit systems. Their public transit fare from just bare 1 peso to 6 pesos, and you can, take it to everywhere, in a big, city of Mexico. I feel like it's I remember their, Metropass, their subway only costs 5 pesos. And I can ride in for the whole day just for, 6 pesos. They have 9 subway lines. And most importantly, the Mexico City, they really keep their public transit fare affordable, very affordable for the people of Mexico City. And Mexico is not as rich as Canada. Mexico City is not as rich as Toronto. And I think I really recommend, the official of the municipal government of Toronto, maybe you get a chance to visit Mexico City to learn from the people there. And as I said, we have a much better financial position than Mexico. And there's no excuse, for us, not to run the TTC as a much better situation, level than it is now. There is no excuse for the government or TTC not to provide affordable fare to people who need.
You'll have to wrap up, please.
Okay, no excuse not to lower the TTC fares, to fund more bus-only lanes, to fund other TTC capital needs like more streetcars and buses, as well as provide much better TTC services. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Laurie McIntyre. Laurie McIntyre. Sabita Desikar. Sabita Desikar. Julie Cruz. Julie Cruz. Zahireen Tarafdar. Did I pronounce that okay?
Almost.
Almost, okay.
It's almost right.
That would be a no.
I'm working on it. Welcome, whenever you're ready.
Great. Good evening, Councilors Nunziata, Councilor Crawford, and Councilor Layton, and everyone still here tonight. My name is Zahireen Tarafdar, and I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Toronto. I'm speaking today to urge City Council to allocate more substantial funding to transform TO, the City of Toronto's Climate Action Plan, on behalf of the University of Toronto Environmental Action. I know that each of us feels the impact of the climate crisis on a daily basis. I remember a few years ago when my parents and I had to stay in an emergency shelter for 2 nights during a really bad ice storm because our house had no access to electricity. The drive to the shelter was terrifying. The roads were slippery, and there had already been several incidents in which tree branches had swung down onto cars and to people. We've all felt these changes in the city. Unprecedented peaks and lows in temperatures, changes in rain and wind, freak flooding and ice storms. And this is the sort of unpredictable future that we're heading into as the impacts of climate change continue to intensify over the next decade. I'd like to speak to this issue as a young person as well. The issue of climate change concerns both our livelihoods and our existing physical and mental health. It is awfully difficult to continue to want to make a difference in a world that you're not sure will continue to exist, and I cannot stress enough the anxiety and feelings of hopelessness that come with having the greatest existential crisis of our times placed on the shoulders of your generation. While I think it's incredible that the City of Toronto declared a climate emergency last year, I also ask that the city continue to take their responsibility in creating a healthy and livable future for ourselves and for future generations seriously. While there have been some very positive steps outlined in the 2020 budget proposal, particularly with regard to the hiring of new staff and the budgeting of capital funding for the installation of thermal energy on city buildings, we're still not doing enough. As has been cited by numerous previous speakers as well, the city's estimated operating budget for Transform TO at $18 million only comes out to around $7 per resident. This is well below that of other cities. Take the city of Vancouver, whose operating budget for climate action is $48 million and translates to around $80 per resident. I ask that City Council adopt a climate lens in planning for the impacts of climate change into all budgetary decisions, and that they fund and implement an ongoing process to report to the public on the climate impacts of major city decisions, especially with regards to emissions. I also ask that the city develop a dedicated climate action fund and seriously consider sources of potential revenue, for example, congestion charges, as has been mentioned in the Transform TO reference panel, to help fund this. When my parents immigrated to Toronto from Bangladesh, one of the countries which is already most impacted by sea levels rising and by loss of life and habitat destruction, they believed they were moving to a city that cares about the futures of their children. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much for coming. Next is Mylène Tuelde.
Mylène Tuelde, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to try to make this quick because I know we all want to go home. So good evening, everybody. My name is Mylène Tuelde. I am currently a resident of Toronto St. Paul's, but also a very proud ex-resident of York South-Weston. I rely on the TTC as my main form of transportation, but the fares are simply too high. TTC has proposed a 10-cent fare hike to all Presto fares, along with a 5-cent increase to the Fare Pass fare. The TTC is the least subsidized transit system in North America. For reference, as Councillor Layton mentioned earlier this evening, TTC users are paying 71% of the fare. 71% of the fare. Our transit system is too heavily dependent on the fare box, meaning the city is relying too much on poor and low-income people to fund the city's needs through user fees. The TTC launched a campaign last year about the alarming rate of fare evasion, but what's alarming to me is that our Transit Commission and our City Council support the idea of punishing poor and low-income people for not paying their fares. This, to me, is a shame. Transit must be accessible to all. The Wheel-Trans operating budget includes a $3.8 million in efficiencies, which I'm kind of terrified that it might mean that it's pushing users to use conventional transit, or AKA the Family of Services Plan. I want to live in a city that recognizes that transit is a public good that is accessible and inclusive regardless of income. I want to live in a city that recognizes that when folks aren't quote unquote paying their fares, it's an indication that the fares are simply too high and that maybe that ought to be addressed instead of punishing us with tickets and fines, we can't afford. Not to mention the alarming point in the budget about the city anticipating $10.2 million in revenue through fines. A shame. I am calling on council to stop the hiring of more fare enforcement officers, especially if council is intending on implementing a budget that, from an equity and anti-discrimination lens, as per the Ontario Ombudsman, the hiring and implementation of fare enforcement officers must end. In July of 2019, the Toronto Star released an article on how more than a decade's worth of data collected from issuing tickets on the TTC disproportionately reflects high numbers of Black transit users being fined. As well, the current narrative around fare evasion
makes me uncomfortable because of the not so subtle threat that if fare evasion isn't stopped, then transit will go bankrupt. This isn't an accurate depiction of what's been happening in this city. Fares remain high, I think roughly 42% above the rate of inflation. Meanwhile, property taxes have remained remarkably low. And of course, we all know that John Tory only just recently announced an increased property taxes this year. The TTC has been lacking in essential investments for essential vehicles that keep folks moving in the city, and overall, the broken promises on transit expansion as a result of changing governments over the last roughly 10 to 15 years. I am recommending that City Council fully implement all 3 phases of the Fair Pass. Currently, only Phase 1 and part of Phase 2 has been rolled out. Public housing tenants have been included from the pass despite plans to have them accessing it by now. The current budget is only allotting about $500,000 towards technology development and application for low-income testing. To fully fund the program, the city needs roughly $25 million. I am also recommending that the city implement a commercial parking levy, which I know we've heard a lot about today, as well as vehicle registration taxes, which I do also support. With respect to the commercial parking levy, it can raise a similar amount of revenues as the city building fund. But instead of relying on transit riders and homeowners to fund the needs of the city, we can access revenues from businesses in Toronto. In 2016, City Council commissioned a report from KPMG which indicates that a commercial parking levy could bring in, roughly 171 to 535 million per year in revenues. Business taxes, not to mention, have not kept pace with inflation over the last 10 years. They have fallen by 30% as a share of city revenues and are now over $200 million per year below what inflation would have provided for. Overall, please fund the Fair Pass. Please stop the hiring of fare enforcement officers. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Reverend Maggie Helwig. I'll run down the people who haven't been here, but yeah, this is, I think, the last deputation. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry that I got here too late. Thank you for letting me be on the list anyway. And, you know, I will try to be brief because I am the last person on a long, long list, and I wouldn't blame you if you've all pretty much checked out now. I'm the Reverend Maggie Helwig. I am the chair of the Social Justice and Advocacy Committee for the Anglican Diocese of Toronto, and I am the rector of the Church of St. Stephen in the Fields in Kensington Market in Councillor Layton's area. I want to say first that I want to express my gratitude to Mayor Tory and the Budget Committee for at least entertaining the idea of finally raising property taxes. This, honestly, is the first glimpse of hope I feel like I've seen for some time. And I hope that doesn't seem like an overly strong statement, but from where I am, in my neighborhood, in the work that I do, I feel like I've spent the last 10 years watching the city, which I have loved so much, become increasingly like a kind of dystopia inhabited by the very rich and the desperately poor. Many people have already talked about the situation with housing, the constantly growing waiting lists for social housing, the number of households paying 50% or more of household income on accommodation, the number of people using the shelter system, the number of people who aren't even using the shelter system but just sleeping in the streets and the ravines. I am working with these people every day. I am dealing now with people who have been homeless not just for years but for decades. I see them losing hope. I see them deteriorating. I take people to the hospital with preventable health conditions like sepsis, and they are released back onto the street again because there is nowhere else for them to go. You probably know that the thousandth name was added to the homeless memorial at the Church of the Holy Trinity this week. You know that people are dying of overdoses, in many cases linked to desperation and poverty. You know these things. I also know that there are in my congregation, or have been in my congregation, many young employed people, in some cases young people employed in the early stages of professional careers, who have left my church because they have left Toronto because they cannot afford to live here. Because Toronto is not an affordable city for young working professional families. It's becoming a very strange city that way. And the only way that this is going to change is if we have city builders with real vision. And I think we're at least starting to creep towards that, at least the idea that it's possible to raise property taxes. I want to speak strongly in favor of the vacancy tax. I think that is an extremely important measure to be bringing in. We know there are many, many units sitting empty. This is both an incentive to rent them and a means of generating revenue. A higher rate of property tax on buildings over $3 million. The restoration of the vehicle registration tax, the commercial parking tax. I'm listing measure after measure. I don't think we have to select just one. I don't think we have to be modest. I think we have to say to the people of Toronto, this city has been a beautiful and inspiring city, and we don't have to lose that. We just have to be willing to be a community, to share our resources. And good taxation measures are one way of doing that. Thank you for taking the steps you have taken. Please have the courage and the vision to go even further than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. So I'm just going to run down the list of people who hadn't shown up just to make sure that they're not here. I'll go down. Olivia Day, India Das Brown, Maya Fahili, Mayamuna Hassan, Zena Hassan, Lori McIntyre, Sabita, yes, she did actually, Sabita Desikar, and Julie Cruz. No, Julie didn't. Yep, she did. No worries. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and I appreciate the time we spent. And I do have a motion that the speakers who have not oh, that's the wrong one. It's been a long day. That the Budget Subcommittee for City Hall and Topical Civic Center consultations received for information, the public presentations and communications submitted by members of the public. It has been a long day. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Thank you. In the Topical.